Good morning. Welcome to the Church and Mental Health Symposium. My name is Steve Duson. I'm the Executive Director of Interface Samaritan Counseling Centers. On behalf of the task force today, I welcome you and thank you for taking this as something that's important and coming today. Well, we've all felt it, that sinking, helpless feeling when confronted by behavior that we don't understand. Whether in your family, your community, your church, or yourself. That subtle paralysis that comes from either not knowing what to do or say, or not wanting to admit that what you're seeing is mental illness. To open today, we've invited a group of actors to illustrate dilemmas faced by clergy, staff, and church members. Our first situation is a couple struggling to reconcile their faith and the challenge of loving someone who is very different from them.
Well, he comes down the aisle, and you could smell him across the room, and he sees us and comes directly to our pew. I didn't look at him. I didn't want to encourage him, but here he comes right next to my wife and sits down. I mean, sits down right next to her like she's his best friend. I don't know, something about that just didn't sit well with me. Get it? Sit well.
George, this is not funny. I was very uncomfortable.
I know, I'm sorry. We do know him, of course, from our streetwise ministries here at Rockwell Baptist Church, and he's not quite all there, and he was probably hungry.
Well, yeah, we know him, but we're not his buddies. I mean, he can't just come up and start talking to us like we're on the same level or something.
Well, we don't really know where he's coming from. Maybe he is smarter than us.
Oh, right, and that's why he's on the streets. I mean, didn't he tell you his life story when you fed him lunch last week?
He said he had family in South Carolina and an ex-wife, and that he used to be a professor at the University of South Carolina, something about biophysics or English literature, I think.
And that's probably not even true. I mean, I don't mean to be cruel. I want to help them lead better lives, and I want them to come to Jesus. I just don't know how to talk to them. I mean, I really can't identify with them. I mean, how do people get to this point? Well, what do they want from us? I mean, I just don't know what to do with this guy.
And now the sister of a woman veteran with PTSD explaining to the church nursery worker why this veteran just lost control when picking up her child after church.
I'm so sorry, Mrs. Blaine. I just turned to say hello to someone, and when I heard all the commotion with my sister Connie demanding her daughter, I know. I do understand how frightening it must have been for you. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Blaine. I should have been more diligent. Yes, of course you have to think of the children. And my husband and I are trying to help my sister through this, whatever it is. She hasn't been herself since she got back from her deployment overseas. Of course it was inappropriate. And she would never say or do anything to hurt anyone. If she was in her right... Well, I don't think anyone was in real danger. I was right there to take over as soon as I saw what was happening. I understand your concern, but surely you can see that Connie just needs help. Oh, no, please don't turn little Maddie away. She needs her friends right now more than ever. We'll make sure that Connie doesn't come near the children's center, but Mrs. Blaine, Maddie is not the problem, and... Okay. Thank you for your prayers.
And now a teenage girl as she tries to process the suicide of a friend in her youth group.
Church really hasn't been the same since Eric killed himself, you know? And, well, it's not like I knew him really well. He was always just this guy that was in youth group sometimes and then not. Pastor Pete had some counselors come in after he did it, and they're all like, you know, it's not your fault and you couldn't have done anything different, but now we just talk about regular stuff. You know, it's like it never happened. I don't know, it's just weird. You know, no one even talks about it anymore, except for like texting, but that's not really talking. You know, it's been 3 months, and no one even mentions it anymore. It just makes me think no one cared about him. Makes me think no one cares about us. Makes me think no one cares about me.
And now please join with this young man who struggles to convince his parents that his sister needs help when the parents don't want anyone in the church involved or aware of the problem.
Don't cry, Mom, please. I don't know what to do either, but we need to do something. I know Annie sounds okay on the phone right now, but that's right now. At any moment, that could change. And you know that her mood swings are dangerous, not just for her, but for Kimmy too. I can't take care of her, and neither can you. She needs help. We need help. We need to know how to help her. Yes, Dad, I did talk to Pastor Dylan, and you know what? He is kind. You know what? And he said that we can count on him. I don't understand this. I don't understand how you can put your family's health in jeopardy simply because you're afraid of what other people might think. So we're not perfect. So our family has mental health issues. So what? You think a neurological disorder is any less acceptable than your heart condition? Or Mom's rheumatoid arthritis? You think that somehow that makes us pariahs? You know, social outcasts. Like, that's not good enough for our church family. Well, you know what I think? I think that Jesus doesn't see a difference. And if our church family can't look at us the same way that Jesus does, then maybe we need to find another church. Because I can't live like this anymore. And neither can you, and neither can Annie or Kimmy. Then what the heck are we supposed to do?
Finally, let's visit a pastor who's feeling the strain of dealing with a troubled member of his church.
Jim, I don't like this guy. He comes to me saying he's worried about his job security. There have been talks of layoffs. He's naturally worried about his taking care of his family, and he doesn't want to worry his wife, so he hasn't told her. I asked him to pray for security and peace and wisdom and trust God. Then I pray for him and he leaves. The next day he's back. His wife is leaving him. What? Yesterday his wife doesn't know anything, and today she's leaving him? I always thought she was a stabilizing force in that family. A good mother and an attentive wife. I know she's real good with her 6th grade girls in Sunday school. Then he's talking about his wife and how she's really just fed up. And he knows he's no good, but he just can't stop. And I get this terrible feeling in the pit of my stomach. I don't know what he's going to say, but I know it can't be good. Then he asks me if I can promise that everything we say in that room is confidential, that I can't share it with anybody. Jim, it took everything that Jesus could give me to stop me from walking out that door. I didn't want to know. I don't want to know. I don't know what to do. Jim, his wife says he's touching their little girl, and the guy's not denying it. I mean, he's a deacon in my church, for heaven's sake. I know he came to me for help. I know he's asking for help. And I know he trusts me to keep his secrets. And I know Jesus loves him, but I do not. I can't breathe. Oh, my stomach. What do I do?
God just planted me too close to the floor. I'm Charlotte Kibler. I have chaired the task force that has put this event together. And I would like very, very much to thank St. Andrew's Church for letting us have the event here and for hosting us and being so kind and so helpful. And especially for Margaret Bremer, who you just heard, who has been absolute gold in helping us do the things that we needed to do to make this happen. I would also like to thank the task force. Would the task force members please stand? Where are you? Stand up. These people have spent a lot of hours and long, hard work to make this happen, and I am so grateful to them. You know, I lived in New York City at one point, and one night when I was going home from the subway, I saw an older woman who was standing over by a wall. Her legs were swollen and dripping, and she seemed to be muttering. And so I went over to her, and I said, "Are you all right? Can I help?" She swung around and let loose with a rage that was unbelievable. I stepped back, and from then on, when I saw her, I walked off to the side and made sure I didn't encounter her again. Isn't this the way that for thousands of years those with mental illness have been treated? The stigma, the fear, the not wanting to be there and to just pretend it isn't there has been phenomenal. And yet, in those 1,000 years, the treatment that these people have received, they've been beaten, they've been chained to walls, much of this so that the demons that they were believed to be possessed by could be beaten out and would leave. Well, it didn't work, and it doesn't work. And then they were put in places where they were with criminals. This kind of treatment has been inhumane. So why do we care? What difference does it make? Well, we believe in a God who loved us so much that God came and lived here among us and died on a cross to save us and to give us forgiveness. That kind of an example came not only in that, but through the whole life of Jesus. Jesus healed people who were physically and mentally ill, but Jesus did something else too. You know, there were outcasts those days, the lepers. Jesus would not only heal, but he would touch them. And so we have an example, and we are now the body of Christ. We are here to help those who are weak, those who are poor, those who are rejected, and those with mental illness. Mental illness does not happen as an isolated issue to a person or a family. It is really a community problem. Paul put it very well when he talked about the body and how if one part of the body hurts, the whole body suffers. You know that. Try getting a headache and not having all of you suffer. And that's the way it is with our community. So if this is a community problem, then we need a community solution. The churches we come from are communities. Our congregations are communities that can offer to people the relationship that they need. Most people who suffer from mental problems live in isolation, either their own choice or because everybody else rejects them. But what they need is meaningful community. And God calls us to serve those who need community. Today is our first step in beginning to move that way. Today we will learn about illness. Today we will hear about things people have done and can do. We, as the Church of Jesus Christ, have an opportunity to begin to be a light to the world. And with that light, we can begin to chip away at the stigma that surrounds mental illness. Today, we can begin a mission that could change the world. And now I want to start us with prayer, but I'm not going to say words. We are going to sing our prayer to God, the opening prayer. It's the one that says, "Help us accept each other." And so now, let us pray in song. Amen. And now I'm going to turn this over to Steve Doosan again.
Thank you, Charlotte. Charlotte is a force of nature who has created this through much effort, sweat, and tears. You're about to hear a remarkable story about a remarkable family. You're about to see how real mental illness can be. You're about to see how even smart, well-educated, talented people can have mental illness. You're about to see the impact that the church can have on recovery from and management of mental illness. You're about to see how good treatment, time, and a loving environment can help those who suffer to find hope, peace, and healing. Dr. Elizabeth McInvale-Cegelski is an assistant professor at the Diana Garland School of Social Work at Baylor University. Liz is also adjunct assistant professor at Baylor College of Medicine and founder and president of the Peace of Mind Society. But today I'm also pleased to introduce Elizabeth's father, Jim McInvale, whom you all know. But you're perhaps unaware of his journey as a parent these past 20 years. When Elizabeth was 12, she was diagnosed with a severe case of obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD. Liz and her family have battled a debilitating mental illness since then. She will be the first to tell you that it is a battle that is not won, but it is something that can be managed with acts of love, faith, determination, skilled treatment, and grace. By the end of this story, you'll not feel sorry for Liz. To the contrary, you will admire a well-rounded woman of God that functions at a level most of us only dream about. And by the end of it, you won't just know Mattress Mac. You'll know Jim McInvale, the father who has been tested by a long and complicated journey with a daughter that he loves so much. Ladies and gentlemen, I am so pleased to introduce Elizabeth McInvale-Cegelski and her father, Jim McInvale.
Thank you, Steve, and what a wonderful conference and opportunity to be with so many people who share in the same mission, right? We're here to help, to offer hope and love, support and guidance to the least, last, and lost. I have to tell you, 20 years ago when I was, who knows how old I was then, but, 9-year-old, kind of just having fun, hanging out, enjoying life, I don't think I ever realized I would be one of those people. That I would be marked and categorized as the least, last, and lost. That I would be written off and told that I would never graduate high school. That my parents would be told they should accept my life as it was, miserable, hopeless, and that they should consider a placement for me for the rest of my life. I didn't imagine that then. I have a hard time remembering that now. Why are you here? Why are we here? I thought 5-10 years ago that you guys and myself, that we chose a profession where we could wake up every day and help people. Where we could wake up and say, did we make a difference? Did we touch somebody who was hurting? Did we offer them hope and support they didn't have before the day started? But what I've realized the past few months is that that career chose us. God didn't I don't believe God gave me this terrible illness. I've never believed that. But what I believe is that God has found a way to make something terrible into something meaningful. It doesn't mean, and it will never mean, that I wake up in the morning and I'm grateful I have OCD. I don't. I never will. But I wake up in the morning and I'm grateful that I have a loving God who has shown me and taught me that when you're faced with perseverance, you can help other people. And you know what happens when you help other people? The healing is greater than any treatment, any love, any support I could have gotten. Because for the first time in my life, I realized that there was a purpose. When you wake up every day and you say, why do I have this illness? And you wonder why you're struggling so much, it's hard to find hope. But as a friend kind of talked to me once about a sermon she heard that hit home to me really hard recently. Jesus didn't say, "Why do I have to bear the cross?" He did it. He knew it was his mission, and he accepted that. It doesn't mean he willingly wanted to die that day on the cross for us, but what he knew is that God had a plan and God's will had to be done. And so what I've learned and what I've accepted is that although I don't love my mental illness, there's no doubt about that, there's a purpose for it and there's a reason. And although it's nowhere near the salvation that Jesus provided us, I do believe I've saved or helped a few lives. And that makes it all worth it. So I was diagnosed with OCD when I was 12 years old. When I got the diagnosis, at the time, I was taking 6 to 8 hour showers, probably showering once or twice a week, if that, because of the difficulty when I was showering and what the rituals and experience was like. I want you to envision, a 13-year-old kid. Not very often do they want to be around their parents or spend a lot of time with them. But getting stuck. I was stuck and trapped. At the time at my parents' house, most of the rooms had become contaminated in my mind. It's kind of a OCD term we use. And I would shower in my parents' room. And I can remember eventually the water turns cold. You don't have, or back then we didn't have a tankless water heater. Maybe people do now. But the water's cold. You're in the corner. You're shaking. You're shivering. And my mom would have to literally come in and pull me out of the shower. You see, I wasn't done. I wasn't done ritualizing. I wasn't clean enough. I didn't feel good enough. It didn't feel like I was complete. But I also was exhausted. Mentally exhausted, physically exhausted, and I was hopeless. But I had faith. I didn't then have the faith I have now. I certainly didn't understand the meaning. I certainly didn't understand why I was going through what I went through. I spent countless nights praying and asking God, why? Why me? Why this suffering? What did I do to deserve this? I think my mom did the same thing. Said, why? What can I do? Can I take that burden from her? And what we had to learn as a family and myself is that I couldn't get rid of this illness. But what I could do is learn how to manage it. With proper treatment and proper care, I could get to a place where it doesn't mean I don't someday say why. I was crying to my mom 3 nights ago when I said to her, she said, we were talking about, my sister said, well, just come to Kentucky and go on vacation. My sister loves horses, and she's in Kentucky a lot. And I said to my mom, I said, he's laughing because it's true. If you know her, she just loves it. And so she's in Kentucky with the horses, and I said to my mom, I envy the fact that some people can get up and go. I wish I could get up and go somewhere and for one day, maybe even just 1 hour, not think about my OCD, not think about my life, not worry, not be guilt-ridden and struck and consumed by anxiety. I wish that when people say, take time for yourself, go do something for you, you need it, you deserve it, do they know what that means? If I went and stayed at my parents' have a beautiful place in Austin, and I said to my uncle, well, maybe I should just go there for a little bit and clear my head. He said, Liz, what would happen? If you went to Austin for a week and you weren't working and you weren't busy, what would happen? Those of you that are mental health professionals know what would happen. A week later, I'd be stuck in bed wishing I wasn't alive. I have to have a purpose every day. I don't always want to have a purpose. There's days I wish I didn't have to. I wish I could just relax and enjoy, and it doesn't mean I haven't learned to be able to sit and feel the sunshine and be grateful for it. I have. But it also doesn't mean I can get rid of my mental illness, which is still a part of my life and in my mind every moment of every day. My dad's sister, my Aunt Julia, when I was probably about 14, gave me a small cross, and on that cross it had Proverbs 3:5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Became the most influential quote in my life, and it still is to this day. Because you know what? When things don't make sense and I'm more confused than I ever have, I can take that scripture and know sometimes it's okay to not have an understanding of what you're going through. But if you put your trust in God, He'll figure it out. I've learned that. I've learned that God will figure it out. We spent the first 2 to 3 years searching and hoping. We lived right here in Houston. My parents had wonderful connections, and we continued to face roadblocks and dead ends. We were told time after time again that my treatment would not be successful, that there wasn't available treatment for my OCD, and that there really wasn't much people could do. Thank goodness I have parents who are sellers, not buyers. He'll try to sell you something later. But they continued to say, they didn't buy that, right? They didn't buy the fact that there's not help for our daughter. They didn't buy the fact that this is how her life's going to be. They knew there was a chance, and they knew there was hope, and they kept searching, something I'm grateful for every day. 3 years later, we found the Menninger Clinic. At the time, many of you might know of Menninger now in Houston, but at the time, Menninger was in Topeka, Kansas. I would be amiss to paint that picture of me going to Menninger as some glorious, beautiful day of the beginning of my path to recovery. Instead, it was a day where we had a Navy SEAL sitting at my house who helped capture and involuntarily take me to the treatment center that I resisted so much. I didn't resist Menninger because I didn't want treatment and I didn't want to get better. I resisted Menninger because every treatment I had tried failed. I didn't believe in you guys. I didn't believe in helping professionals. I didn't believe there was help available to where I could be where I am today. What also scared me was that my mom made a promise to me. My mom doesn't ever back out of her promises, but when her promise to me was, Liz, I promise that as soon as you're well, you'll get to come home. I know that was a promise meant for hope, but instead for me, I figured I was never leaving there. But something happened. I spent 90 days at Menninger, and my life was completely changed. 90 days later, when I was leaving that treatment center in Topeka, I cried just as hard as that day I came. This time I wasn't crying because I felt like I could never imagine having a dream again. It wasn't because I felt like I was lost and I was alone and I had no will to live. Instead, I was crying because I was leaving people who had become my family, who had become people who I will hold on a pedestal higher than any other. Every time I get a voicemail or an email from Dr. Bjorgvinsson or any of my Menninger staff, or even my current therapist, Konstantina, who I still see, there's something about them telling you that they're proud of you that makes you say, wow, I'm really doing something good. But what I'm proud of is I'm proud of them. I'm proud that they chose a profession where they didn't believe that the least, last, and lost should be forgotten. Instead, they believed that they could be saved. And it didn't mean that I didn't have people who tried to go about it the wrong way. It doesn't mean that when we're a faith community, right? I'm a part of Baylor now, which is a wonderful institution where I have the opportunity to practice professional clinical social work with an integration of faith, something I really wasn't super aware of before I started my career there. But it doesn't mean we always get it right. How many of you have sat with a client and the only feedback you can give is, let's pray about it, or you should pray about it? And I'm not being critical, I'm not saying that's right, that's wrong, but there's effective, evidence-based treatments that we know work. Doesn't mean faith can't be integrated. Right? Part of OCD is scrupulosity, and that's something that I've always lived with really strong. So no matter what, faith had to be integrated into my treatment because half of my struggles, my faith was intermingled in. But unfortunately, things like when the priest came over and put holy water over most of the house, hoping it would uncontaminate it, it didn't work. Doesn't mean he was wrong. It doesn't mean he didn't want to help. It doesn't mean we didn't have the right intentions, but sometimes our interventions aren't right. So our job is to continue fighting, continue searching until we find the ones that work, until we find the ones that make sense. But more importantly, your job and our job is to sit with those who need us. People say, what was the best thing or the most influential part of your treatment? And I don't know, there's 1,000 things. The first is that I had parents that didn't give up. I had parents that kept searching for treatment because they believed I could be something more than what they were being told. I had siblings who sat with me, who cried with me, who gave up their life their high school life and their friendships because they were worried about their sister. I look now, and I would be amiss to tell you I don't struggle every day and that I don't have difficulties. But what I do know is that I know the way to survive. It doesn't mean I thrive every day. It doesn't mean I don't have struggles. But when I'm having a bad day and you go see, I hang out with my nephew who's 5 and tells me he's going to live with me forever because of how much he loves me, it puts things into perspective. It makes me realize I have something to fight for even when it feels impossible. I do have to share my biggest pet peeve because I think it's important for us to talk about today. One thing I've struggled a lot with in relationships and in my life is when people say things to me like, don't use your OCD as an excuse. That's happened a lot to me over the past 4 years, and I've tried my best to understand it and to accept it. Because when you live with a mental illness and people say things like, that's an excuse that you're using, what happens? You start to believe it. You start to believe that it's some excuse and that you have control and that you should be doing something different. But the reality is that it is no different than someone who has heart problems saying, gosh, I'm not feeling well today and I need to see my doctor. Or my medication needs to be adjusted, or I think my insulin is off because my blood sugar my levels aren't reading right and something's wrong. But no matter what, every one of us in this room, we have some sort of stigma to mental illness, including me. Why do I accept that? Why, when I hear that, do I accept that, oh my gosh, I am using it as an excuse, and I need to remove my mental illness from my life or from my profession? I don't, because I can't. It's a part of me, it's a part of who I am, and I've learned, or I'm learning, that if people can't accept that, if people can't understand that, then I have to let them go. I went to a sermon recently at Second Baptist, and they talked about toxic people and toxic relationships, and the sermon really stuck to me because it talked about how there was over 30 passages in the Bible where when people came to Jesus and they didn't believe his story and what he was selling, right? That he was the Savior and that he died on the cross for us, he let them go. He let them walk away. He didn't chase them. He didn't say, let's compromise, and if you half believe me or you half believe this, he let them go because they'll come back. I am so grateful that you guys don't buy these stories or that you have been exposed to be able to have a different understanding of mental illness. One that you don't turn your head to, you don't say you're using it as an excuse, but instead you have empathy and love because you know the suffering is real. When people talk about suicide, when people talk about self-harm, one of the things Dr. Ellis told my class recently when he came and talked to them, he's a wonderful, wonderful therapist at Menninger, is he said, some people will say, oh, when someone's engaging in self-harm, it's a cry out for help, or, they're doing it for attention. No, they're doing it because they're suffering. Do you realize, or do we realize the amount of suffering and pain people have to be going through and experiencing to truly believe there's no hope for me on this earth? Father Rossi, my sister lost her best friend last year, and Father Rossi helped us come to terms with it through this amazing email where he talked about the fact that life isn't about how many chapters are in your book, but it's about what's filled on those pages. And what I've learned is that although there's many days I wake up every morning and say, I'm ready to be with you. I'm ready to be in a place where I don't have to experience suffering and I don't have to experience pain. I've also realized that maybe God feels my pages haven't been filled yet. So my promise is that I will continue filling those pages with good work and service to people who struggle the way I do, to people who struggle more than I do. Because if there's not that in the world, if there's not 1,000 Mother Teresas, what are the hurting going to do? I'm so grateful for all of you because you are out there every day making a difference and impacting lives just like my own.
I am her dad. I am very proud of her. We are here to tell our story. I do wish these were solid wood tables made in America by Gallery Furniture, I must admit that. I think Charlotte said that many years, decades, centuries ago, the mentally ill were criminals. In our enlightened age, in 2016, the Harris County Jail is the largest mental health facility in Texas. So how enlightened are we? Mental illness, you see, is a cruel disease. No one knows who it may strike or why. Mental illness never goes away. It lasts forever. My child will always be walking on the edge of the cliff. I cannot keep her from falling, but I can reach out my hand. I think Charlotte said earlier that people with mental illness are smarter than us. She's right. My wonderful child, who they said they would never graduate from high school, got a PhD 2 years ago from Baylor University in social work. And she's smarter and speaks better than her daddy. As she mentioned earlier, I'm in the racehorse business, myself and her sister. I want to tell everybody here today we became millionaires in the racehorse business. The only problem is we started out as billionaires. But anyway, I went to see this woman the other day to talk about these racehorses. Her name was Temple Grandin. Temple Grandin never spoke till she was 4 years old. She had autism way off the scale. They said she'd never amount to anything. Temple Grandin now has a PhD in animal husbandry. She's 69 years old. She teaches at Colorado State University, and she knows more about animals than anybody on the planet. She is smarter than us. I had better go on now to the script she wrote me, otherwise I will be in trouble. Liz taught me to talk about the importance of having the church as the backbone of the community. And I read a lot of business people, and one of the business guys I really admire is a guy named Clayton Christensen. He is a PhD in business at Harvard University, and he wrote one of the most famous business books of all time called Disruptive Innovation. He's also a very devout Mormon. Thought I'd read this to you. He said, "Some time ago I had a conversation with a Marxist communist from China. He had been invited to Harvard for a 2-year Fulbright fellowship in Boston. And so before the day before he was to fly back to China, Clayton Christensen invited him to his home, and they had dinner and with his wife and family. And he asked this Marxist communist from China if he learned anything that was surprising or unexpected during his visit to the United States. Without any hesitation, the Marxist communist said yes. He said, "I had no idea how critical religion is to the functioning of democracy." He said the reason why democracy works is not because government was designed to oversee what everybody does, but rather democracy works because most people, most of the time, voluntarily choose to obey the law. He went on to say in the past, most Americans attended a church or synagogue every week, and they were taught there by people, pastors they respected. The Marxist communists went on to say that Americans follow the rules because they have come to believe that they weren't just accountable to society, they were accountable to God. The Chinese friend heightened a vague but nagging concern. Clayton Christian said that I've harbored inside. That as religion loses its influence over the lives of Americans, what will happen to our democracy? Where are the institutions that are going to teach the next generation of Americans that they too need to voluntarily obey the law? Because if you take away religion, you can't have enough police. Our job is to be hope for the hopeless. Our job is to embrace the mentally ill. Our job is to realize that they go through things that you and I never thought about. It was blood-curdling when this child was 13 years old. Her mother lived with her upstairs for 2 years trying to comfort her. And she would scream every night, "God, I wish I was dead. What did I do to deserve this?" And when she'd beg her beloved mother and sister for hours upon hours every night to kill her, it was hell on earth. Because you see, when one person has a mental illness in the family, everybody has a mental illness. And I'll never forget one day, Liz and her mother and her sister were on Lake Travis boating, and Liz was driving the boat, and it was dusk, and Liz ran the boat up on a sandbank, and they got stuck on the sandbank for several hours, and finally they got the boat unstuck and drove it back into the dock. And her mother said, "You know, Liz, that's very, very dangerous. We could have been killed out there, drowned." And Liz said to her mother, she said, "Mom, I'm not afraid to die because I know being with God would be so much better than what I go through here every day." And so what are we going to do? The church is the backbone of society. The church welcomes the mentally ill. The church says, "You're different, that's okay." And I'm also here today to say thank you to all the wonderful pastors who everybody they see is in a stressful situation. How often do we nurture those pastors? And these actors up here today were so wonderful, the one about the pastor counseling with his church member. They need our support as well. This child tried college 4 or 5 times and she didn't make it through. And finally her friend lived at Loyola University and lived in Chicago, so Liz decided she'd try one more time at Loyola University. And she went up there, and her teacher, she enrolled in social work because Liz had learned by then that work was life's greatest therapy. By helping other people with mental illness, she could help herself, so she wanted to be a social worker. And her first teacher was very instrumental, and Liz asked her teacher how she'd got involved in social work. She said, "You know, well, my parents are from a very wealthy family here in Chicago, and every Thanksgiving and Christmas we would go to the soup kitchen and feed the homeless." She said, "I always wondered why we had so much and these other people had so little, and I decided to become a social worker." And I went to Loyola University in Chicago. She said, "Throughout my undergraduate years, I would always write to Mother Teresa. And she said, Mother Teresa would always write me back. She said, when I graduated from undergraduate school, I want to take a year off before I got an MSW in social work. And she said, I got on the plane one day and flew to Calcutta, India, and that night I slept on a pallet 4 feet away from Mother Teresa." And she said, "I worked with her for 2 years. And she said Mother Teresa had one rule against all medical protocol, that when we helped those sick and dying people, the lepers, the people with AIDS, the people in the streets in Calcutta, nobody could wear a mask or gloves because human beings in their final hours needed that human touch. And nobody ever got sick." She said one day Mother Teresa told her pack a change of underwear, "We're going on a trip," and they got on an airplane and flew across the world, and next thing they knew that Liz's teacher and Mother Teresa were walking through St. Peter's Basilica, and there's millions of people there and helicopters and press everywhere, and Mother Teresa's diminutive little woman and Liz's teacher fairly tall. Mother Teresa looked up to her and said, "You know, what's all the commotion? What are all these people here for?" And Liz's teacher said, "Mother Teresa, don't you understand?" She said, "No, I don't understand. What's the commotion?" She says, "Mother Teresa, they're here for you." It's about living a life built for others. Clayton Christian has another wonderful article. It says, "How will your life measure up?" At the end of the day, it's not about how much money you and I have. It's about how much of a difference we make. And so we go on. The takeaways from this wonderful child today who's been through so much in her life is that she is an inspiration to me and her mother and her sister and her brother and her nieces and nephews. She never gives up. She fights that OCD every single day. You and I don't understand because it's a different world. But she's in the fight every day. And she's in the fight helping people. So thank everybody for being here today and for being a voice for the voiceless. Hope for the hopeless. Takeaways. Show empathy and love for those different than us. They're not weird, they're just different. Like Liz McInvale and Temple Grandin. They just learn in a different way. Number 2, don't get stuck on why do they act that way. They act that way because that's the way they were made. Love them. Love them, don't judge them. And number 3, walk with them to help them find the best way and the best treatment. As you have heard from the beginning, his command is that you walk in love. Monty Williams is a basketball coach at the Oklahoma City Thunder. You may or may not have read the eulogy he did for his wife when his wife was killed by a driver going the wrong way on a one-way street. I highly suggest you read it. He said, the Bible says in Psalm 133, "Behold, how good and pleasant is it when brothers dwell in unity." God is good, God is love. And we know that God causes all things to work together to those who love God, to those who are called to God according to his purpose. Before Monty Williams finished that eulogy, he said we should all forgive and pray the family of the lady who killed my wife, who was also killed in the car accident. He said she did not get up that day wanting to kill my wife. It happened. We should not forgive, we should not judge, and we should be helpful to those who have mental illness, to those on the street. The good news is people that are advocates for the mentally ill are doing what's important. Monty Williams said as he closed his eulogy, let's not lose sight of what's important. God is important. What Christ did on the cross is important. You and I, changing our point of view and helping the least, last, and lost, and those in our community with mental illness, that is what is important. Thanks very much.
I have the privilege of introducing our very distinguished panelists, so I want to tell you a little bit. First, we have Dr. James W. Lomax, who is a distinguished physician, has worked in the field of psychiatry his entire career. He is the Brown Foundation Chair in Psychoanalysis, the Carl Menninger Chair of Psychiatric Education, and Associate Chairman and Director of Educational Programs in the Menninger Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Baylor College of Medicine. If you're not exhausted by now, I don't know what's wrong with you. He is a graduate of Rice University and Baylor College of Medicine. He is an adjunct professor at the MD Anderson Cancer Center and the Institute for Spirituality and Health of the Texas Medical Center, where he also serves on the Board of Trustees and chaired the planning committee for the annual Psychotherapy and Faith Conference for 25 years. He is an affiliated scholar and board member of the Hope and Healing Center and Institute of St. Martin's Episcopal Church. Of most importance to me, he is an outstanding human being who I am privileged to call friend. When I called Dr. Lomax to ask if he would participate in this symposium, after wisely checking with his wife about their travel schedule, he gave me an unhesitating yes. He also recommended to me two of our panelists today, Dr. Sylvia, I've said it 3 times in my head right, Muskie, Dr. Sylvia Muskie and Dr. Matthew Stanford. So will you first please welcome Dr. Jim Lomax. Okay. We're thinking on our feet here. Sylvia Muskie, MD, is the medical director of one of the largest, most culturally diverse community health centers in the United States, the Harris Center. You may know it by its former name, the Mental Health and Retardation of Harris County. She provides direction and oversight for the practice of psychiatry within the center. The scope of services includes 6 outpatient clinics that serve adults and children, several school-based clinics that provide services for children, and mental health services inside the Harris County Jail, providing mental health services to adults. She has faculty appointments with the University of Texas Houston Medical School and Baylor College of Medicine. Her interest is in responding to the mental health field's new paradigms and challenges to successfully transform our local mental health system into a recovery model approach. Incorporating and integrating religious and spiritual resources into the care model is pivotal to the transformation of mental health care, and IDD systems. And I had to ask her what IDD means, and it is intellectual and developmental disabilities. So please welcome Dr. Muskie to our panel. Let's just stand up, please. Next we have Matthew S. Stanford, PhD. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the Hope and Healing Center. He has served as Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at Baylor University, Director of the doctoral program there, and is the Executive Director and founder of the Mental Health Grace Alliance. Dr. Stanford holds a doctor's degree in Behavioral Neuroscience from Baylor University and is a Fellow of the Association of Psychological Science. He is the author of over 100 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters in psychology, psychiatry, and neuroscience. He has helped many families and individuals affected by mental health challenges and mental illness, recovery, and purposes of life. He is the author of 2 books, Grace for the Afflicted, a clinical and biblical perspective on mental illness, and The Biology of Sin, Grace, Hope, and Healing for those who feel trapped. Please welcome Dr. Stanford to our panel. Dr. Stanford, would you stand up? And last but not least, we have Reverend Dr. Peter Holmes. Dr. Holmes was born in the United Kingdom and holds a PhD from Birmingham University in the UK. His degrees are in ecclesiology, psychology, and therapeutic process. He has combined a career in business and planting communities of faith in Europe. He's an expert in therapeutic community and serves on the board of the Council of Therapeutic Communities in the UK and is a lead reviewer of the Royal College of Psychiatry. He is a fellow of the British Chartered Management Institute. He has published 10 books on a range of subjects and has authored numerous academic papers. He is a member of the Tyndale Fellowship and co-founder with Dr. Susan Williams of the Rafa Journey movement. Please welcome Reverend Dr. Holmes to our panel. I think you all will agree how very fortunate we are to have such a distinguished panel to share their wisdom with us today. Before we move on, though, I want to tell you, you have little note cards on your tables. So as our panelists speak, they're each going to make a presentation. You can write any questions that come to mind, and they will be picked up after everyone has spoken. And I will pose your questions to the panelists during our Q&A time. So, panelists, will you please take the stage?
So the panelists sort of decided we're going to come up one at a time, so we don't have to navigate the panel, the table back there. When Helen told me I was going to be on the presentation today, she didn't tell me I was going to follow Elizabeth and Jim McInville. I'll have to warn you for the subjective experience of what's about to take place, that one of my patients, when she was terminating after several years of a very intense, very difficult series of things in our treatment relationship, she told me that I had helped her to appreciate the value of boringness in interpersonal relationships. kind of a compliment. But, Helen asked me to go over some of the major common psychiatric disorders in a very kind of 30,000-foot overview. So I'm going to do in a roughly 20 minutes that with the disorders she asked me to consider today. The plan is to go over the key features of the disorders, something about the magnitude of them, some of the big picture key elements of treatment, and mention community resources. As a kind of continuing theme I would like us to be thinking about, and I'll come towards the end to a specific reference about the congregational role in healing, and healing as defined by Luke Timothy Johnson, the Emory theologian, is restoration to community. So that's where what we're going to do with each of these things today. So I'm going to begin with schizophrenia and the psychotic disorders. These are in some ways the most debilitating of the illnesses, and one where we're struggling to find treatments like we are with several of the disorders. The elements of the schizophrenia that were referred to in the actors' presentations earlier involve, first of all, delusions, which are fixed and false beliefs. Delusions can be of a variety of sorts. The persecutory delusions, in which people feel like they're being followed, or people are trying to hurt them all the time. Referential delusions, where people are constantly feel like everything in the environment is focused towards them, and they're experiencing special sorts of communications even from their television or radio. Grandiose delusions, in which the people believe that they have some kind of special power or connectedness, or they're a very special, important person, or related to somehow a very noteworthy person. What's called erotomania, which means that people believe that they have special connectedness often to some sort of public figure who's secretly in love with them and communicating to them about that. Nihilistic delusions, in which there's a kind of experience of nothingness in themselves, in the world, that everything is fake, phony, and there's really nothing. And then somatic delusions, often with rather bizarre ideas about bodily functions and horrific and hideous sounding experiences of parts of their body rotting inside them. People with schizophrenia also characteristically have hallucinations, which refers to an experience of a sensory type without a sensory stimulus for it. So the hallucinations can be of a visual sort, or a auditory side, smells, bodily sensations, generally odd and kind of extremely dissettling. People with schizophrenia generally are, as was referred to in the acting episodes nicely, that have trouble with disorganized speech and thinking. Their speech is so disorganized that it used to be called word salad, which means everything is just one after another that don't connect with anything, the words that come into their mind. And then the negative symptoms, which are some of the most difficult to treat, and only the newer types of antipsychotics, beginning with clozapine, really help those very much. But it has to do with the lack of ideas, lack of speech, and lack of any interest in social contact. So many of the people that you see as homeless are people who just cannot tolerate and then actually have no wish for social contact. And that's why you've seen in the papers in the last few days there are people who don't want to be in a home of any sort. How many people saw A Beautiful Mind? Well, in a lot of ways, that's an absolutely wonderful presentation about the severity of the illness, and that's not all of the person. That he was a Nobel Prize winner. But even when he got the Nobel Prize, there was that image in the background of the people who he thought were trying to get to him and haunt him. a little difficulty in that movie is that to do a movie, you have to show everything as a visual phenomena. So there were the people in the background, not voices. It's just hard to do that technically in movies. So most people with schizophrenia who have hallucinations, they don't have visual hallucinations. That's a pretty small minority of people, but they do have these auditory things which are absolutely hideous and frightening. The lifetime prevalence for schizophrenia is about 0.5% of the population. If you just hear it that way, it doesn't sound like a lot, but if you think about 0.5% of the city of Houston, that's a whole lot of people with this horrible illness. And as was alluded to by Jim McInville, the largest treatment facility in almost every city in the United States is the county jail. In Houston, we're very fortunate that Sylvia and her team provides care in that county jail, but that's really a problem of the prioritizations of our society too. The treatment for the psychotic disorders is predominantly and at the base going to be psychopharmacological. It's very rare that people don't need sustained lifelong treatment. You've probably heard of the typical antipsychotics. Haldol would be probably the most commonly used one. And then there are the more recent development of a wide variety of what are called atypical antipsychotics. And that's not a terribly helpful designation, but risperidol is one that is probably the most common. They each have different sorts of things. Also important in the care of people with schizophrenia is the psychoeducational sorts of treatment programs, and they're fundamentally around helping family members and community members to try to not push people with psychotic disorders into relationships or activities that are disorganizing for them. So it's having, and that's easy to say, it's hard to do because people with these disorders often evoke powerful emotions in the people around them, whether it's fear or disgust, and it's this kind of a compelling sense to do something about it that simply is not going to be in the cards for many people with this disorder. Sylvia, I think, is going to talk a little bit more about the relatively newer treatments called the recovery programs. They do a wonderful job of that at MHMRA, but these are pretty ambitious programs to help people with very severe, debilitating illnesses, like Elizabeth, who you saw, but these illnesses are even more disorganizing than her obsessive-compulsive disorder, to have meaningful roles that fit and work for them. So recovery is a pretty ambitious program, but realizing the limits of the illness. NAMI is the organization which is specifically grew up and to be helpful to people and families with this type of illness. We don't have anybody from NAMI in the waiting area out there, but there are some references in Mental Health America that are also quite valuable. But it's awfully helpful if people in the congregations get to know somebody in NAMI. Bipolar disorders are the next large group of the severe and persistent mental illness. This disorder is diagnosed because of the presence of a manic episode. A manic episode this is the illness which used to be called manic depressive illness. When I was first on the support group I'm going to refer to is called the Depressive Manic Depressive Association, and I'll get back to that in a little bit. But a manic episode is a distinct period of elevated mood with irritability. The irritability I'll come back to several times because that's an awfully important part of the mood disorders. Again, people with bipolar disorder and a manic episode can have grandiose delusions in their part of their symptoms. These usually are less bizarre than people with schizophrenia, but often clearly inaccurate and more personally oriented. They have pressured thoughts and speech. They just can't keep up with their own thoughts. And because of that, they have a distractibility, so it's hard for them to do tasks which they, when they're not having a manic episode, they might be excellent at, but when they're having the episode, they can't function. They tend to be hyperactive, and each of the activities may in itself have some purposefulness, but put together, they generally cannot conduct activities successfully, which they used to be able to do. The manic episode is characterized by risky behavior, driving too fast, having dangerous sexual contact with other people, buying gifts or spending money they don't have, and causing huge financial problems for themselves. One of the both consequences and sometimes cause of a manic episode is decreased sleep. So if a person has a manic episode, is in the midst of one, they don't feel like they need sleep, and if you sleep deprive someone, you can sometimes provoke a manic episode. Unfortunately, if a physician who's going to be on call as an intern doesn't tell us that they have a history of a manic episode, we can sometimes ill-advisedly, and we've unfortunately done this, provoke a manic episode. Bipolar II disorder also, in addition to the manic episodes, does have depressive episodes. Again, these are distinct periods of a lowered and then often irritable mood. The lowered mood or depressed mood is often accompanied by irritability. In this episodes, the person tends to have what are called neurovegetative symptoms, which means they cannot experience pleasure or joy or things that were previously made them happy. Their appetites generally are decreased, and their activity is generally decreased and often very secluded. The ideas of the depressive episodes are negative views of the self, others, and the future. That's the negative cognitive triad of Beck and other sorts of people. So I'm no good, other people hate me, and the future is going to be miserable. Worthlessness and guilt is a characteristic of the depressed episode. Guilt for things they either did or thought about doing, not even necessarily anything that was actually done. A kind of pathological indecisiveness and a kind of preoccupation with death and suicide. The bipolar II disorder is, for our purposes, I'm just going to say it's a somewhat less intense version of bipolar I disorder, where you have hypomanic as opposed to manic episodes coupled with major depressive episodes. There's generally less treatment pressure, either from the person or from the environment, for that person to get help. And while some people have a kind of relatively successful life career, it's often highly painful, and the irritability that is in both episodes often makes relationships extremely difficult to sustain. That's marriage relationships, couples relationships, business relationships. It's just hard to be in relationships with people, and it doesn't make any difference how smart they are and how productive they are. It is still very difficult. The magnitude, about 1% of the population, so a little bit more frequent than schizophrenia. For this mood disorder, that's about an equal gender basis, so men and women are affected about the same, slightly actually more males, but minuscule things. The suicide risk is increased with schizophrenia, but with bipolar disorder, it goes up to 15-fold the population. So it's a huge risk factor. I'm particularly interested in this disorder because that's how I got interested in psychiatry, with my mother's bipolar II disorder, and the way that had devastating effects for my father and threatening effects for our family. For me, one of the most important things was that my father stood in there and stayed with her and became kind of a model for me about how stay with someone with a very severe and often threatening and disturbing mental illness, as did my mother's psychiatrist, Pascal Clark, who some of you might have known. So the suicide, as Elizabeth referred to it being on her mind a lot, this is a big deal for the bipolar and mood disorders, and does cause damage not only to, of course, the individual who completes suicide, but to family members and everyone around them who wonders, what did I miss? Why couldn't I have been more helpful? What went wrong? So you're left with these horrific, difficult questions. So the treatment for bipolar disorder is heavily dependent on what are called mood stabilizers. Lithium was the first one of these and is still the one that has the most help for suicidality, but there are a variety of others. The antipsychotic agents that are treated schizophrenia that we've mentioned before are also helpful for many people with this disorder. Antidepressants are used in the depressed episode, but always with a little bit of anxiety by the treating professions, because they can evoke a manic episode as part of the recovery from depression. So that's a practically very important thing to consider if you have someone with depression who has a family history of bipolar disorder. The psychoeducation is also important. Individual therapy of both cognitive behavioral, psychodynamic, and interpersonal sorts may be helpful. Couples therapy, because of the irritability and how that affects relationships, is often extremely important. The common resources, this is the Depression and Bipolar Support Association. They do have a little table with some handouts there, and this is their website. This group has just been fantastic in its growth and the anti-stigma over the course of my professional life. They've just done wonderful things. The major depressive, the depressive disorders, it's hard to cover this in the short amount of time, but there are 4 of them I want to at least mention. Major depressive episode, persistent depressive episode, which is also used to be called dysthymia, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is, again, important because it is a predictor of postpartum depression and the serious, sometimes dangerous behavior for the mother and the infant with postpartum depression, and then also for perimenopausal depression. So women who have significant irritability and depression in the last few days before they start their period, that's a real problem. It is not to be ignored, and it is to be taken seriously in itself and as a predictor of things that might need help. The schizophrenia and bipolar disorder are heavily genetically based. The bipolar disorder is the disorder with the strongest evidence for genetic influences, and if you have a family history of bipolar disorder, you do have a huge increase in likelihood of that in your children. The genetics that we've struggled with are, it's not Mendelian genetics, so it's not the simple sorts of genetics that are present for some diseases. It's a kind of confluence of gene vulnerabilities which make the person have the disorder, and especially in schizophrenia, we probably lump together 100 or more different types of genetic vulnerabilities, and Robert Cloninger's work around this is especially important. Depression, unlike the bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, is a clinical diagnosis and a final common pathway. So you can get depressed because of psychological factors, because of interpersonal factors, sociocultural factors, and even spiritual factors. And I don't think I'm going to have time to talk about those very much, even though it's a particular interest of mine. Depression is significant because it worsens other medical conditions. Excellent studies about how having depression makes cardiac disease worse, it makes stroke worse, it makes the HIV and renal diseases worse and more difficult to treat, and it's serious because of the tenfold increase in suicide. But depression is treatable, and it's treatable by a variety of different modalities. The magnitude about depression, this is a huge incidence. It's around 7% per year, and about 15% of the population over the lifetime are going to have meet criteria for major depression. In contrast to the bipolar disorder, women are affected twice as often as men, and there's probably a hormonally related factor in that. And I mentioned that suicide risk is about tenfold. The treatments for major depression include the pharmacotherapy. Here we have good evidence base for several different types of psychotherapy, from the psychodynamic or the cognitive behavior, interpersonal, and the mentalization-based psychotherapies, which was developed through the Menneker Clinic and University of College London. ECT is extremely helpful in the serious episodes of mood variations, both manic and depression in some types. I know that's a highly stigmatized treatment, but it is life-saving. My mother was one of the first people to get ECT in Texas when she had a postpartum depression after my birth, and it continued to be a life-saving treatment for her. Some of you may be aware that there's a new series of treatments going on around the drug called ketamine, and this is a whole new way to approach the pharmacological treatment of mood disorders, which is highly promising, but is still early and still experimental. The religious and spiritual factors, we've touched that a little bit, and hopefully in the question and answer portion, we can come back to that. There are positive and negative ways of using religious resources for coping. The notion of sanctification or making something sacred, that also has very positive things for people, but it makes people more vulnerable to huge loss when what has been sanctified, a relationship or an activity, is lost or betrayed, especially. So we mentioned the Psychotherapy and Faith Conference. We'll have our 25th conference in November, and Alexander Moreras, our keynote speaker, Ken Pargament, is coming back, and we're very excited about doing that, and hope some of you can attend that. Some of you have already. So I've given Helen a paper by Griff Griffith at George Washington University. It's a very thoughtful outline of how faith communities can help people, especially with the recovery issues and helping with psychoeducation. I also gave her this, I think it's an inspirational paper by a Baylor faculty member who talked about what she learned from her depressive illness, and it is a kind of like Elizabeth, it's a way to take something difficult and make something very good of it. These are my consultants, and thank you.
Want to let you know that I am your public health servant here. I am the medical director for the Mental Health Forensic Services, what was formerly known as Mental Health Mental Retardation Authority of Harris County. We have changed our name, and we're now called the Harris Center. So anyway, I was asked to talk about mental health in youth, and I was going to start off with a video, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to start off with the big question, why? Why do children develop mental illness, and why do many end up in the correctional system? And I'm hoping that my brief presentation can shed some light. As many of you are aware, we are the most obese population in the world. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world. We have the highest rate of diagnosed mental illness, substance use problem. Our academic achievement with kids is lagging. Our life expectancy is decreasing relative to other developed nations. And I could go on and on and on about the unhealthy status of our U.S. population. But we appear to be in the midst of a public health crisis.
and that trauma and toxic stress are a key component of the factors for these outcomes. This paper, written by Drs. Blanche, Schern, and Sturveman, does a wonderful job outlining the role of toxic stress and trauma in the combination with the genetic vulnerability as a reason to our declining health and well-being. It was a report that came out through the Mental Health America. So let me begin just doing sort of a basic overview of childhood psychological stress. So we have three types of stressors: positive, tolerable, and toxic. Not all stress is negative. We have positive stress, which is sometimes rare, mild to moderate, and builds resiliency. We have tolerable stress, which is usually a little more frequent and sustained, considered moderate to severe, but there's no sustained changes recognized. But when we talk about toxic stress, which is frequent and sustained stress, it's severe, we begin to see changes occur. This diagram shows the relationship between toxic stress and brain development. We know that the brain is not fully mature until the age of 21 or 22. Sometimes people say 25 years of age. So our brain is developing until that point. So if a child experiences a stressful traumatic event and the exposure is frequent and prolonged, it activates the stress response system, which then triggers the release of chemicals that has been found now to impair the brain development and functioning. And we begin to see children who are beginning to have learning difficulties, behavioral, mental, physical, and social problems. So let me put it this way. Imagine you're walking in a forest, you see a bear. Immediately, your body kicks into gear. The release, stress hormones, your adrenaline, cortisol start pumping, your heart starts pumping, your pupils start dilating, your airway becomes open, and you're in this fight or flight mode. And this fight or flight mode is usually what happens to help you survive the situation, correct? But what the problem is what happens when the bear comes home every night. And the system is activated over and over and over. Instead of being an adaptive life-saving, it becomes maladaptive and health damaging. So let me talk about trauma, because toxic stress occurs when there is a trauma. And we know that trauma is now considered to be a near universal experience of individuals with mental health and behavioral problems. While trauma is a normal reaction to a horrible event, the effects can be severe, that they interfere with an individual's ability to live a normal life. So, trauma, let's talk about the definition. It results from an event or a series of events or set of circumstances that's experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening and has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. Facts about trauma: it affects everyone. Doesn't matter the race, your sex, your background, sexual orientation, geographic, your region. It affects families, groups, community, specific cultures. It ignites the fight, flight, or freeze reaction, and it produces a sense of fear and vulnerability and helplessness. So trauma, we know, can stem from many, many things. We have child abuse, neglect, war, other forms of violence, witnessing violence, physical, emotional, sexual abuse, grief, loss, accidents, natural disasters, people witnessing violence, medical interventions, going sometimes through chemo, radiation therapy. Then we'll have cultural, historical trauma. Sometimes an individual in the family has experienced trauma and they talk about it over and over and over, and it affects the rest of the family. That's called historical or intergenerational trauma. So we know that trauma, the impact of trauma, that 70% of adults in the U.S. have experienced some type of traumatic event at least once in their lifetime. That's 223.4 million people in the United States. We also know that individuals that have behavioral and mental health issues, 90% of these individuals have experienced a traumatic event. So that was trauma. Let me see if it works. The impact, the 70%, the 90% of individuals with behavioral and mental health. And so here is a study that I wanted to talk. All this information about trauma came to light back in the 1990s when the CDC and Kaiser Permanente discovered that an individual's health and well-being is a product of their genetic makeup and the environment in which they grow and live in. So I'm going to briefly review the study, starting with the ACE study, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. This study surveyed 17,337 Kaiser HMO members. They asked them about childhood trauma or adverse childhood experiences. They surveyed, the majority, 70% of these individuals were Caucasian, the age was 57, and 76% had attended college, and all reported having good jobs and good health. And this is what the study showed. And there were 10 categories, and they were broken up into abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. So what they found was 29% had reported physical abuse, 11% had reported emotional abuse, 20% reported sexual abuse, 18% had reported emotional neglect, and 10% had reported physical neglect. Now, they had these categories called household dysfunction, and it stemmed from someone in the household who had a substance abuse problem, someone who had a mental illness, someone who had been incarcerated, someone who had witnessed their mother being treated violently, and divorce. And those are the percentages that they found in each of those categories. What they also found in this study is that 70%, as mentioned, had experienced an adverse childhood event, and that 40% had reported 2 or more adverse child events. So what came out of it? What was the impact to having an adverse child event? Well, they said the higher the number of the ACE scores, the more likely you were to engage into high-risk behaviors, such as lack of physical activity, smoking, alcoholism, drug use, missed work, and that this led more likely to increase the risk for negative health outcomes, such as obesity, diabetes, heart disease, suicide, sexually transmitted disease, cancer, COPD. And as you can see, many of those illnesses are the leading cause of death in the United States. So I talked about high-risk behavior, substance abuse, self-harm, isolation, and aggression. There's a movement to call, instead of calling it high-risk behavior, adaptations, understanding that these are individuals, trauma survivors who have adapted to unhealthy living styles, but they're adaptations. So that's what this slide's just pointing out. So this is sort of what the final picture of what the studies showed. The slide puts it all together. It makes you understand how the exposure to early childhood experiences affects the developing brains of the children and their bodies, and that exposure leads to a disruption in the brain development that can lead to social, emotional, and cognitive impairment that leads to engaging into high-risk behavior, that leads to disease, and then to early death. So it just puts it all together. Just another slide that shows all the health-related risks with adverse child exposure or signs of toxic stress. And this slide, although the exposure to toxic stress and trauma is universal, not everyone exposed is as adversely affected. But the study did show that even if you were exposed to an adverse event, but you did not engage into sexual or into high-risk behaviors, that you still had a higher risk of developing heart disease and cancer. So it does show how the continuous stress and the development in the brain and the body, how ultimately we might see the effects later on in life. So this is basically to show how healthcare is becoming more aware of these experiences, and we need to begin to ask, but it's important that we phrase asking these individuals what has happened to you, not what is wrong, and to focus on what their strengths are versus what their negative issues are. This is the first step to helping someone enter into recovery for their mental illness and overall well-being. So recovery, it is possible. We've seen it. We heard Elizabeth, and it is possible. That is one thing that we all need to understand. I like to use the definition that Dr. Bill Anthony, who's the psychiatric rehab guru, and he says, recovery is a way of living a satisfying, hopeful, and contributing life, even with the limitations caused by the illness. It involves the development of new meaning and purpose in one's life as one grows beyond the catastrophic effects of mental illness. So next steps. I highly encourage everyone in this room to take a mental health first aid course. We have a booth out there for those that might be interested in taking it. Let me just tell you a little bit about mental health first aid. It's like CPR. It helps assist you in addressing, managing individuals who might be in a mental health crisis or not in a mental health crisis. The course helps you learn risk factors, warning signs for mental health, addiction concerns, and strategies on how to help someone in crisis or not in crisis. One of the practical things that you will get out of the mental health first aid that I will share with you, because if anything, hopefully you can take this home and utilize it immediately. It's the first aid action plan, ALGE. A, when you meet someone, you will always need to assess if this individual is at risk for suicide or harm. L, listen non-judgmentally. Very important. G, give reassurance and information. E, encourage appropriate professional help. E, encourage self-help and other supportive strategies. Self-help and supportive strategies, this is where the faith-based community comes in. It's a key component in helping an individual build resiliency at any age. We have to remember that our brain is a social organ, and you guys are part of the social community and the healing community. These are things that I know I'm preaching to the choir about positive attributes, physical activity, encouraging these individuals to do these things. But I think the main thing that I'd like to drive home is to remind everyone in this room, the biggest thing anybody could do is give agape love, that unconditional love. Don't give up. It can get frustrating. It can drain you. You will have to take breaks. But the important thing is that anyone who is suffering from mental illness needs to know that they can come back to see you and that you won't judge them and that you will love them unconditionally. This is a key component to getting someone to recovery. Anyway, this is just a slide to show us what our new logo looks like and the services that we provide. Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Matt Stanford. I have chosen not to do PowerPoint for any number of reasons. Jim asked me, when he asked me to do the symposium, he asked me to talk about two things, and then of course gave me 15 minutes. So whenever you give a college professor 15 minutes, that's not a good thing. So this is toxic trauma for me, which I have to do. So I'm the CEO of the Hope and Healing Center, and I'll talk about that a little bit as I go through. But the two things I'm going to talk about today are some work that we've been doing and I've been doing over the last, say, about 12 to 15 years on looking at how the mentally ill interact with the local church, how to better equip therapists to deal with spirituality and religion in the therapeutic environment, and then also a broader initiative that the Hope and Healing Center and Institute are doing with the Miniger Clinic and Memorial Hermann to better equip our faith communities. So I'll start with this. Most of my work and pretty much my life at this point is driven by a statistic that I came across at this point probably over 20 years ago, and that is people that are in psychological distress are more likely to see a clergy first before they see a mental health care provider or a physician. And what's interesting about that is, a lot of times people kind of push that off and say, well, we're a very religious society. That statistic is actually not just for religious subgroups within the population, it's for even people who don't believe in God or aren't involved in faith communities. Americans, in general, are more likely to see a clergy when they're in psychological distress first
before a mental health care provider or a physician. It's an access issue. It's very easy to get in. You can show up here, someone will be here, someone will talk to you. And I became very interested in that because we have a mental health crisis among us right now. A majority of people with mental health problems, these terrible disorders that Jim and Sylvia have talked to you about and that we deal with every day with our clients, a majority of people with these illnesses receive no treatment in a given year. So it's 60% of people with a serious mental illness receive no treatment in a given year. That's pretty shocking in the United States. And as was mentioned earlier by some of the other speakers, you know, the 44 states, the largest psychiatric facility is a jail. 30% of the people wandering the street here, homeless, have a serious mental illness. There are 10 times more people in jails and prisons with mental illness than there are in hospitals. So, I mean, it's a disturbing thing to imagine. It's a taboo topic that we don't talk about. But as Sylvia and Jim talked about, we do have wonderful treatments if people can access those. So the statistic that I just said about people going to clergy first, the question, you know, for psychologists like myself have been, well, then we'll call that the gatekeeper model, which means that individuals will go to a clergy, they'll show up here for whoever the pastor is here, they'll see him or her, and that person will then, with no training or awareness, recognize that this is a mental health problem and then make a referral to the proper type of mental health care provider. And that's called the gatekeeper model, and I could probably stack papers 3 feet high on this podium up here of people who've written about this wonderful model that absolutely doesn't work because no one ever told the pastors that they were part of it. And so, you know, a majority of pastors do not refer. They don't know that they should refer, and they wouldn't know who to refer to if they had to. Now, if you walked in the office with a gash in your arm, they might know what to do. If you walk in the office and you say, well, you know, my wife is spending all of our money and I don't really understand what the problem is, or we're not getting along very well, you know, you might not recognize that as undiagnosed bipolar disorder. And so that's a problem. So we began to look at, I became very interested in what happens when people show up at faith communities with these mental health problems. And unfortunately what we found is that, you know, about 30 to 40% of those are very negative interactions where the faith community tells the individual that what their problem is spiritual. They don't recognize it as a mental health problem. And then they take a spiritual approach to that, meaning that they tell the person, what's wrong with you is you have weak faith, personal sin, or the demonic. I believe in weak faith, I believe in personal sin, and I believe in the demonic, but that doesn't cause schizophrenia. And so the thing is that, you know, people take more of a spiritual approach. That's about 30 to 40%. The majority just don't know what to do. They just offer some immediate comfort, and then kind of like, well, that's about the best I have. I don't really have that. And so they just really don't feel, I just gave a talk yesterday at a suicide conference over at Houston Baptist University and showed some data from youth pastors where, you know, over 80% of youth pastors are saying they personally are working with congregant children, adolescents that have depression, yet, you know, over 80% of them say they don't feel qualified to even work with these individuals. And so they're working with them, but they don't know what to do. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to get a better sense of how to equip faith communities. Another aspect of this is people are very interested in spirituality and faith in their therapy. As Sylvia and Jim have mentioned, and many of you know, when people come into a therapeutic environment, they're very interested in discussing where is God in all of this, how is my faith to be incorporated in all of this. And what you find with most therapists, unfortunately, is that they've been trained that that's not something that you're supposed to talk about with your client. That's wrong. You are able to talk about that, but I was involved in clinical training for a long time, and most students think that you're not supposed to talk about that because somehow that will be your own faith will get in there and mess everything up, and that's not really the issue. But unfortunately what happens is most therapists will ignore that, or they will say, well, you need to talk to your faith leader about that, and then that will be the end of that. And I used to think that was kind of okay if you know kind of had this Pastor Joe off in the background somewhere that you could refer people to. But then I started I had a student ask me a question that said, does it matter what the church teaches them about God and their mental health outcome? And I thought that was a pretty profound question because I never thought about that. And so we began looking at some work that had been done by a Baylor sociology department. They did a national survey of religion. They do it every few years. It's kind of a snapshot of religion. And they found that individuals, regardless of their faith tradition, tend to see or image God along 2 dimensions. And one dimension, if you imagine a dimension of engagement, where God is either very engaged in your life or he's not engaged in your life. So this is a dimension of engagement. And the other is a dimension of a judgment. So he either judges you very harshly on one end, and on the other end, he might have ideas for your life, but he doesn't judge you if you mess up. But it's these two dimensions. And actually, we began to look at that clinically to see what happens. And so one of the first things we found is that individuals, it's the engagement dimension is particularly interesting. The more you feel God is engaged, the more mentally kind of protective it is. The more you feel God is judging you, the more anxiety issues you have. And began to look at these things together. We found that indeed for engagement, the more engaged you feel God is in your life, the more self-efficacy you have, meaning the more likely you feel you can change or that there can be a better day for you. In the context of, for instance, what Sylvia talked about, recovery, very important for a person to have hope that they can, hope is the fuel of recovery. If you have no hope that you can get better, you won't be able to recover. And so that's where this motivation to change. So we began to look at these two dimensions. If you kind of think about them as a cross, you find that there are kind of four quadrants. You have a God, a benevolent God who is, we kind of named these. One is he's very engaged, but he's not real judgmental. That's the benevolent God. You have the very engaged God who's very judgmental. That's the authoritarian God. Okay, that's Zeus. You mess up and he whacks you, but he's real involved. He's watching you every minute. On the lower end of involvement, where they're not really involved, you have the distant God. He's uninvolved in your life at all, and he really could care less if you mess up. He won't judge you at all. He's like kind of the God of deism, if you know what deism is. Kind of wound the clock up and then he went off somewhere. And then you have the critical God, and that's the God who isn't really involved in your daily life, but he does notice every time you mess up and judge you, okay? And so what's interesting about that is we've developed that to a scale now. We begin to gather data on that in different clinical populations. And which one of those God images do you think has the worst mental health outcome? The critical God is the one. And what's very interesting is in these pathological populations where individuals are in distress, for instance, individuals in psychiatric outpatient treatment, individuals that have been arrested are now in a treatment court, individuals that have recently been incarcerated, these populations where people are in distress at the moment, the largest God image you always find is a critical God. Because they begin to ask themselves questions like, am I being punished? And what we find is when individuals hold to a critical God image, they have higher levels of depression, anxiety, they have greater negative emotions, fewer positive emotions, and ultimately their mental health outcomes are much worse. Mental health outcomes are best for the benevolent God, but only slightly better than the authoritarian God. The authoritarian God, actually, the outcomes are pretty good. It's all about engagement. So if you think about that from both a clinical perspective, it's important for the therapist to know what image of God does the person have. Do they believe God is punishing them? Do they believe God is there to help them change or can help them? He's engaged. But it also matters the faith community they go to. If the therapist is working with the individual and trying to gain some traction, but they're going to a faith community that's telling them, well, God's punishing you. That's why this is happening. There's no way we're going to get any kind of recovery here. So one of the things that Jim wanted me to kind of stress is that it is important, the kind of theological bend that we take and the God that we present to individuals, particularly knowing that these individuals come to faith communities first when they're looking for things. Unfortunately, there's a lot of data out there with, on more conservative Christian groups that show that, they will tell you flat out, well, yeah, this is just God punishing you. That's why I have depression. It's a sin. So good luck with that. That's just not really therapeutic. So we have found some really good, so we've developed an instrument, we're gathering a lot of data on that now, and hopefully we'll have an instrument that's going to be useful for even secular therapists, not just faith-based therapists, to be able to help assess faith in the client. Now the other thing I wanted to talk about very quickly is an initiative that we have, knowing that individuals in psychological distress, people with mental health problems, are more likely to go to a faith community first, to a clergy. Why is there not some big government program to train clergy, to set them up as real gatekeepers? It's just not done. It's just not done. And so the Hope and Healing Center, I forgot where I worked for a minute, the Hope and Healing Center, in collaborating with Menninger and Memorial Hermann, we began an initiative to engage faith communities in the Houston area. We offer a training for the clergy and staff called Mental Health 101, which is very similar to what Sylvia talked about, but it's a little bit more focused on, individuals are showing up here with mental health problems. What will you do with them now? How will you serve them? How will you respond to that? So it teaches you how to recognize mental health problems, how to make a proper referral. It connects you through a network of providers that we've developed through the Hope and Healing Center. You have access, faith communities that are involved in this have access to our mental health coaches that can help them with individuals. We'll help a congregation set up a pastoral care team if they'd like. We help put support groups in place. One of the things about a faith community that's so therapeutic is not only is it a front door to the mental health care system, because people go there first so they can get referred to professional care, but they come back there looking for long-term supportive community. And most churches, unfortunately, aren't set up to do that. They're not set up to be a front door, and they're not set up long-term. What they're set up for is Sunday morning service and programs that go along with that. And mental health issues are messy, and as Sylvia mentioned, agape love is necessary. I often say mental health issues, mental disorders are theology changers. They will stretch you to the extreme, and they show you what grace is really all about. So that's an initiative we have. If you are in a congregation that'd be interested in that, if you just go to our website, hopeandhealingcenter.org, you can contact us via that. All of that is free of charge. We'll come in and work with your congregation. It's not just a one-time thing, it's an ongoing thing to kind of help your congregation become mentally health informed. So thank you for having me today.
It was 1945. The war in Europe was beginning to wind down, and there were thousands, tens of thousands of troops returning to Britain. And there was a psychiatrist, Dr. Tom Main, who was working at Northfield Hospital. He had around 2,000 men and women sleeping on mattresses and cots in rooms that were cleared in this hospital, just one after another in rows. He had no idea about post-traumatic stress. He had no psychotropic medicines. He had no knowledge of the trauma that these men and women were carrying. So he did what he thought was best, and he told them to get into groups of between 8 and 12. It had to be with people they didn't know, and they were asked, and they did this for 3 or 4 hours every morning, they were asked to go around the room and tell the rest of the group what had happened to them. Most of these men had already tried going home and pushed back by their family. Many of them found themselves unable to even think about home or to go back and hold down a job. Tom began to audit what they were doing, and after about 5 or 6 months, these men started coming to him and sitting down with him and saying, "Tom, I'm ready to go home." He was the ultimate skeptic. "Oh, really? How are you going to get on?" Quizzing them, cross-quizzing them. And it was very difficult. But then more and more of these men started coming. And later, Tom Main was going to write an article in one of the big medical journals in UK and introduce the concept of therapeutic community. That's now a global movement that I'm part of, working with the Royal College of Psychiatrists in England, and is a medical movement, but it's also a lay movement. I had my first experience of mental health issues with people working at Crichton Royal Infirmary in the north of England. At the time, it was the largest mental hospital in Britain. I was there as a volunteer, just to work for the summer as part of my theological training. At that time, the Lord began to introduce to me more and more people with various mental and emotional disorders. And that has grown throughout my life. And then in 1990, I was planting a congregation. My wife and I had planted 3 or 4 congregations before then. But this particular one was down in Kent, near Dover, in England. And it grew so fast, we panicked. And I ended up inviting a friend who was a professor up at Cambridge to come down for the weekend, and said, "Can you help us, please? Tell us we're not losing it." She came down for the weekend. She listened to about 25, 30 people, all describing their journey, as we called it. And at the end of the weekend, Sarah sat down and she said, "Well, this is amazing. I have never met so many emotionally damaged people in one place before." And she was a mental health professional, that are turning their sicknesses into healing. And it was then she said, "By the way, you know you're a therapeutic community. I think you need to talk to the Royal College of Psychiatrists." I was doing my doctoral work at the moment at that time, and I threw away a whole year's work and began again when I started learning what we were part of. And the therapeutic community movement works over here big time. It's involved very much with addiction disorders, but also the American federal government have taken up the program, and many of your prisons here are therapeutic communities. It's a movement outside of the church. Recidivism is one of the biggest problems, the revolving door syndrome, as it's described. And a therapeutic community of a wing of a prison doesn't intend to get men and women well. What it does, it teaches them why they're likely to repeat their crimes. And you can imagine the economics of stopping a man or a woman from going back into prison if they're going to go back for the rest of their life. So we worked, my wife and I and a colleague, Dr. Susan Williams, worked for 10 years with Christ Church. We've had hundreds of people go through that congregation and through the therapeutic community programs. And I began to write about it. I've written 10 books. The list is around here somewhere, and you can get them on the web. I dream of a day when we have therapeutic faith communities in every village and town and city across the world, where somebody can walk in who's tried everything else, and that's our typical client, who's been through the medication programs, who's been through the group therapy, who have been through all of the health care treatment plans, and none of it's worked. And in a therapeutic faith community, you can take your time. There's no hurry. It takes 6 months for somebody just to settle and to begin to feel like they belong. We help them to go on the dole. We help them to get out of debt. We get them clothes. And everybody who comes says, well, this is how church should be, isn't it? So 8 years ago, in fact, I was over here in Cody, Wyoming, 14 years ago, doing a pastor's conference. I was asked to produce a pastor's toolbox for people that are having to cope with mental and emotional illness issues in their community. And the leaders of that symposium actually rang me 8 years ago and said, we've planted a congregation in Bozeman, Montana. Yes, there's even Americans that don't know where that is. And we decided that my colleague and I would go over and do a workshop. We did it just for, well, our joke was, select some of your most damaged people that need desperate help, and let's work with them and see what we can do. That was 8 years ago. It's a mega church. It grew from 4 families to 2,000, and that's the level it's at the moment. I'm part of the leadership team of that congregation. I spend about 5-6 months a year over here working with that congregation. And we've done quite a lot of work with people that haven't found help elsewhere. We now have a group of several hundred in that community. And they have built up for themselves, doing their journey and finding healing and wholeness, found a therapeutic group IQ among themselves. What the congregational leaders wanted to do was to move away from employing huge numbers of therapists to actually having people in their congregation, so that when somebody walked through the door who was going through a depressive episode or was feeling trauma from an event 20 years ago that they've never been able to shake off, that we would have someone in the congregation already that's done that journey and can share with them how they managed to break those cycles in their lives. And the therapeutic community movement intentionally moves towards experts by experience and not just by qualification. And what we're looking at here is we're looking at a movement of people not that are qualified academically or professionally to help, but are qualified purely on the basis of I've been there and I've done that. Mental illness is very complex. It's very deep, and it's multi-layered. And it takes a long time, often, to help people successfully. But a church setting is an ideal place to do that long term. And I'm privileged to be here today just to share that story with you. I also don't have a PowerPoint. I wouldn't know how to use one. Sorry. Did I really say that? I'm sorry. But I have written 2 documents for you. One is Introducing Therapeutic Faith Community, which is basically just a bunch of key contact opportunities to get onto websites. The other one is Frequently Asked Questions about therapeutic community, and then there's a list of books we've written that are available on our website. Thank you.
Can you help us understand how we might best deal with someone who is having a hyper-religious or psychotic episode? Anyone? Okay, they're going to self-appoint.
Well, so a hyper-religious, so and is it out of the context of the person's faith tradition? That's the important.
Those who came up with this question, is that out of the context of the person's religious faith? Do we know what we meant by hyper-religious? We do not know.
The reason I ask that is there are wide variations in cultural as well as specific religious faith communities, and what is not only normal in those, but even the correlates with healthy and well-beingness is quite striking. So let's assume for a little while that this is something which is atypical and not part of the person's education, their religious and community, et cetera, et cetera. This is something very odd. Then helping that person to find a mental health provider is going to be high on the list to do. And to try to do that, and as I think Sylvia and Matt talked about before, both being non-judgmental and not talking about whether they're correct or incorrect in their belief, but that they seem to be suffering and in distress. And you know people that can help individuals that are experiencing distress. Now I can say that, I think it's accurate. I think it's awfully hard to do at times, especially with that type of fixed and false belief.
I would just reiterate the idea that you really do have to make sure it's outside their religious context. So, I mean, churches that I have gone to, if a person might come to this church and say, God's been talking to me last week and he told me that da-da-da-da, you might go, well, this guy's crazy, so, but that's perfectly appropriate within that context. The other thing I would say is, and Jim said this person is probably thinking that they're getting a message from God or that they're having personal experiences that are kind of outside that context. It's going to be difficult for you to try to convince them that they're not. And so one of the things I tell people all the time is it's impossible to reason with an unreasoned mind, okay? What you need to do is you need to connect with them emotionally. So they're having emotional experiences, they're excited about this, or they're fearful, or they're angry, or whatever. Validate their emotion, connect with them emotionally. I understand how that would make you so excited. Tell me more about that. That's the way to begin to have that conversation, to be able to move them to where they're going to trust you, as opposed to, of course you're not hearing from God and he didn't tell you that you can fly, or that you're there's no reason to get into that type of a discussion. Try to validate their emotion and try to connect with them emotionally.
We have a woman that whose husband shot the neighbor's dogs. And this happened a few years back. She began to get very disturbed and stressed about this. She was a member of one of the congregations in our denomination up in Montana. And she was referred to us just a few months ago. Every Sunday, she was turning up at the church just before the morning worship, pushing the door to come in and to go to the front and to stand up in front of the church and demand that her husband confess the sin of killing the dogs, and then giving a shopping list of other things that were wrong in the town. And she was very unwell. We worked with the district attorney. In fact, we were talking to him just a couple of days ago. The police do not want to arrest her and give her a criminal record. So we're working with the police and the mental health team to have her committed, isn't it? Say sectioned in England, sectioned. And in order to stabilize her medication so that we can begin to help her.
Do you have any advice to help a congregation that has had no mental health ministry begin one?
I know that one. Yeah, absolutely. You can just simply start with getting the clergy and the staff trained. I mean, that's the easiest thing to begin. You could go to one of the mental health first aid trainings that's done. You can contact us. We'll come to your congregation and do the training right there for our Mental Health 101. But just getting the clergy trained again, it's not necessary that you start a mental health ministry. And I think that's what's important that churches understand. What we're talking about is raising awareness, educating, but then also altering the kind of the sense of the congregation much more along the lines of what our wonderful last speaker talked about, and that is becoming a therapeutic community where people that are broken by mental health problems are not only recognized and then helped to get to professional care, but then are also accepted into the community and that there are supportive systems set up for them that they can be there long term. And so I would say the first thing you need to do is just have your clergy trained. The last thing a pastor wants to hear is that they have to start another ministry. It's the last thing they want to hear. And so what I would say is, and another thing that Peter said that is very important is this is not something that needs to be put on the back of the clergy. This is a congregational issue. I'm very, very much an advocate of peer-delivered services, and so peer-led support groups and things like that. So all of those things the training is there, the training's available. It's right here at the Hope and Healing Center. It's right through Mental Health America, through a number of Harris Center. I was going to say HMR again. But it's all available. You just need to take the time to set up and do it. So.
Matt, the other thing it's nice to do is to start with something that's experience near for the congregation and something that you're struggling with or interested in. I'm terrible about names, but you had a wonderful Methodist minister who was one of your fellows who was working on a program for children with developmental disabilities.
Lorna Bradley.
Laura Bradley. And I thought that was something that I wish could get spread to other. Why don't you say a little bit about that program?
Yeah, Lorna Bradley is one of our fellows in our research institute, and her research and area is equipping congregations to be more inclusive for people with developmental disabilities, which again obviously cuts across some of these things we talk about. But she's developed, she focuses primarily on the couple that is taking care of a child with a developmental disability, because the divorce rate in those couples is well over 80%. So she has a support group for them that she's developed and piloted in a number of congregations. She has a marriage enrichment weekend that she's developed for them to try to enrich their marriage. But then also she goes around the country and she works with congregations, much like the question. It says, well, how do we prepare ourselves on Sunday morning when a family shows up here and they have a child with cerebral palsy or they have a child with autism? What do we do? Because you would be shocked how many congregations will literally tell that family, we can't take care of your child in the Sunday school class, so there's nothing for you here, like you can't even come. And so, so she, helps congregations become a little bit more inclusive and aware of those types of things. And some, have adopted that quite well, and it begins more of a therapeutic community kind of approach. And some are more exclusive, and they have trouble with that. But it's a process. I mean, it's a process of asking yourself, what is a church? And what is, I often say this, if our Sunday morning, structure, if our Sunday morning service, if our Sunday morning approach that we take is somehow pushing people away, it's the Sunday morning process that's the problem, not the people. And so, that's part of the deal here. People with mental illness are messy. They'll make noise, so get up and, I had a client who killed someone because he thought the guy was the Antichrist. And so, they'll do all kinds of stuff, jump up in the middle of a service and yell, but they don't all do that. It's just, thankfully, yes. But the thing is people with mental illness are among us. People with mental illness are us. People with mental illness are not other, they're us. And so, we just need to be more inclusive and accepting of those problems.
I just wanted to highlight what the Reverend had mentioned with regards to many of you probably know someone who has had a mental illness or someone who has a child with cerebral palsy. And I think that peer support is very crucial. Identifying your own resources and your own individuals that are coming to your community is important to refer. Sometimes you won't know what to do, but you know somebody who's gone through the same thing. And that connection is very, very helpful.
Okay, we have a lot of questions here and very little time left. So we have a question, and this comes up a lot within, I think, most faith communities. How do we deal with an individual who is disruptive, repeatedly disruptive, and inappropriate in the community?
You put them in prison, don't you?
Pardon?
You put them in prison?
We don't want to do that.
Sorry. It's often the case that people that turn up at church looking for help are people who already have a huge amount of damage in their life because of church. And it's very important to help diffuse all of that. We have programs where we take people away from church, where we ask them not to read their Bible anymore for a season, where we ask them to detune all of that history and begin to unpack and diffuse it emotionally. And in practice, it's very difficult, and you need a team, and you need people who have been there before. And those are very hard to find if you're just starting out on that road.
So let me just say a practical way. If you are dealing with someone who's in a mental health crisis in your congregation, call 911 and ask for a CERT team, which is a crisis intervention response team. These are police officers that are usually paired up with another therapist to come out and hopefully help address the situation if it ever becomes such a crisis situation. So I just wanted to give the practical 911, ask for a CERT team, or you can also ask for a CIT team, crisis intervention team, but ideally it's CERT, C-I-R-T, okay?
So there's really, I would say, kind of two types of disruptions. There's the disruption that Sylvia's talking about, which I've had a client who likes to go and get up in the pulpit of churches here in Houston on Sunday morning during the service and try to like talk about things that she wants to talk about, even though she doesn't go to church there, and they don't want her in the pulpit. And that is a crisis. I mean, they have no, she just comes in, she goes up, she disrupts the service, she tries to take over, and they have called a CERT team before, and that's a helpful way. But I think another part is, what if you have someone who has associated themselves with your fellowship, who has a mental health problem, who is ongoingly, kind of an ongoing disruption? They make noise, or they won't do what you want them to do, or things like that. And I think that's in those situations, it's not really a crisis, it's just how do you deal with them? And number one, what I would ask you is to think about this. What is it that they're disrupting that you're so upset about? I mean, that's the real question. And secondly, what is it that you have to offer that person? Because they've come there with needs. And do you have anything to offer them? If what you're offering them is, I'm offering you this rigid, structured service or whatever it is, and all you can do is disrupt it, then obviously they have needs. They have spiritual needs just like you or I do. Have you ever sat down with them? Has someone sat down with them and said, what are your needs? Why are you here? What are you trying to gain from this? I mean, you really have to ask yourself, what are we here for? I mean, what has God called us to do? If he hasn't called us to serve and walk along with the broken, then I missed everything when I read it. I think that's what we're supposed to do. The rigid service thing that gets disrupted, I never see that in there. Where Thomas was talking out of place or something and they got upset. So I think what I would say is, if it's a crisis like they are out of control and they're taking over, or they may be a danger to themselves, you call for a CERT team. Absolutely. That's why we have that here in town. But if it's an ongoing issue and they've associated themselves with a fellowship, I think you have to ask yourself, how do I incorporate them into our fellowship? How do we begin to meet their needs? How do we offer them programs and services for what they're struggling with?
Okay, thank you. Do you have some advice to help us help children who have a close family member with a mental illness? How do we help them understand this? How do we dispel their confusion by it?
So again, I think the therapeutic community is very helpful for these kids who have an individual who might have a family member who's dealing with mental illness or substance abuse or divorce, or they've witnessed violence. I mean, that was my focus of my talk, was the trauma of many of what these kids are going through. One of the things that I didn't have time to put in my slides, and I'm very obsessional and wanted to include a lot of things, but the CDC came out with a new report just a couple of days ago, and in the past 15 years, there's a 24% increase in suicide rate. And what they noticed was the increase in the rate was found in kids, young females, ages 5 through 15. Yes, it's very hard. And I think that the key thing is, even though somebody might seem like they're doing well, if there is something telling you that, oh, I need to reach out, I need to touch base, do it. Touch base with them and say, you know what, tell me what's going on. Tell me what's happening. I'm here to help. It sounds like you're struggling with a lot of stuff. And there are ways just to reach out. I mean, the focus is, let me know what I can do to help you. And it's also important to remember is to meet this individual where they're at in their illness. Some of them might not be ready to talk about what they're dealing with, but let them know that you're there. And I think that's a key thing, that they know that they can talk to somebody. You might not hear from them 5 months, 6 months, a year later, but if you plant that seed of hope, that you plant that seed of love, you plant that seed as I'm here for you, you never know, they might come back at your doorstep. So I don't know, does that answer whoever asked the question?
And I also think it's an issue of training. I mean, we talked about the staff. I mean, like literally yesterday I spoke at a teen suicide conference at Houston Baptist University, talking about promoting resiliency. I mean, your youth staff, they need to be trained how to recognize these types of things, how to promote resiliency, how to develop a therapeutic community. When we hear these children commit suicide, we always hear, well, he was a loner, he didn't have any community, he was not supported. Right, you know, but what about his faith community? Were they reaching out for him? I mean, so the thing is I think you also have to have the youth staff prepared and ready for that, to recognize that. I mean, children who have a mentally ill parent, they're much more likely to have a mental health problem themselves, let alone the trauma that they're having to deal with. So, I mean, again, it's just an issue of educating and recognizing what's going on. I think, you know, I have a lot of pastors tell me, look, I never see problems with people with mental health problems. You know, so, I mean, no, literally, I can't tell you how many, I've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of pastors, and I can't tell you how many have told me flat out, I never see anybody with mental health problems. It's an awareness issue, and recognizing that a mental health problem is not somebody running in the office saying, I'm Jesus. I mean, that can be a mental health problem, but the thing is that it's other things also, and I think just educating is a really important part of that.
Absolutely, thank you. Yes, I'd like to know what congregation that is. I haven't seen one yet. So this is kind of related, but I wonder if you have any more specific advice for how we might deal with someone in our congregations who clearly has a mental health issue. I have a couple in my congregation. I know their mental health issue. I can identify it. I can even diagnose it. But they don't know they have a mental health problem, and all attempts to get them help have been totally thwarted. So how do we deal with that?
And then I just want to reiterate what I said. It's important to meet the person where they're at, right. And it can be very, very draining. So I wish there was a way of saying, okay, do this and this will happen. And that's where I go back to the agape unconditional
love.
One of the key ideas in the core values of the therapeutic community movement is that a person is taken from a place where they have secrets, emotional, mental illness, and secrets, to a place where they can talk openly, flamboyantly, without embarrassment or a sense of humiliation, talk openly about their problems. And that's a journey that a person has to do. And the power in a person being able to say that is enormous. I was ... and now I am ... But it's got to be a journey to a place that's a battleground in this country because of people's rights and confidentiality and everything else. And that's a tough call.
I would add one thing to that, and that is, and I see this a lot with the individual who doesn't want to get care because they don't have the insight to recognize that they have a problem. And then what we do is a lot of times we try to take what really has come out of the addiction world is this approach, this kind of tough love approach. Like we're going to just kind of cut them off and they're going to hit rock bottom and then they're going to realize they're schizophrenic. And they're going to get, I mean, it's laughable when you say it that way because that's what we do with people that have addictions, right? We say, okay, well, I'm not going to enable him anymore. He's just going to have to deal with the consequences and then he'll realize that he needs help and then when he comes to me, we'll get, well, you can't enable a mental illness. If you're bipolar, you're bipolar. I can't make you more bipolar. If you're schizophrenic, so don't adopt that tough love approach. That does not work with mental health, like serious mental illness. What you have to do is, again, you have to say, why are we here? If he's disruptive, but how can we incorporate him into our community? How can he be part of it? I would suggest all of you go to a website, it's called The Well Community, W-E-L-L. It is a church, The Well Community. It's a church in Dallas, a very large church. The entire church is people that have mental illness. And I mean serious mental illness. Most of the people live in group homes near the church. They have some fantastic videos on there of their services. And they're wild. I mean, they're wild. But those people are loved and accepted where they are and taken in where they are. And they're drawn there because they know they're not going to be pushed away. They can be who they are and begin to get better.
Thank you. I just learned something very important about the distinction between mental illness and addiction and how to deal with it, and I need to go back and correct something I've told a family. Thank you. I will do that immediately. We have a whole fistful more questions, but it is time for us to move on. Thank you all for your presence here today and for sharing so freely with us. Please offer our panelists a round of applause. Thank you.
We thank you for the joy of being able to be together, for the joy of learning so much, and for those whom we are concerned about. And now we ask you to bless the food and the hands that have prepared it, and to fill us not just for our physical needs, but Lord, be with us and guide us through the rest of this day and each day. Amen.